Hello and welcome to the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Whitaker, and this is the place where we talk about all things relating to Japanese politics in English. And right at the top of this week, I'd like to talk about, again, the Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, and it looks like he's held on. He's survived the gift scandal and its aftermath and his fall in the polls. There was a lot of speculation about his future, but it looks like Ishiba is a little bit stronger than that. He's determined to stay on, and he's demonstrated a sort of stability to his regime, which he could be quite pleased with. So after, as I say, the gift scandal, his giving out these sort of token amounts of what he says are his own money to first-year lawmakers, there was a sort of bit of a scandal with that. It was seen as inappropriate. He mounted a defence and said, it's a customary thing, and others have come out and said prime ministers have done it as well. And he's, as I say, it's a relatively small amount of money, but it sort of harks back to other scandals the LDP have done, like the slush fund scandal. Sort of the idea of inappropriate things happening with money is not a good association for the LDP. But in any case, despite that and the fall in the polls, he's successfully held on to it. He's still in the job, perhaps because there's no clear replacement, a unified candidate coming from the LDP who they could all get behind. There's no sort of obvious single person waiting in the wings. I mentioned some names last week, but I don't think there's any obvious standout who's there determined with a lot of support to take the job at the moment. And also perhaps there's an element of the LDP don't want to go through another round of getting rid of another prime minister leader and just this cycle of ousting their leaders repeatedly. They've already been through quite a few recent leaders over recent years, so perhaps that's not a habit they want to get into yet again. And perhaps there's also a thought of, well, we're probably not going to do well in July anyway, so who would want to step up and take on that job right now when they're going into a July election in the upper house where they could also immediately have a loss of seats. So that's probably got a large part to why he's still in the job, but also his determination to stay on. Also, the opposition, for one reason or another, perhaps they like the idea of him being the one they face in July. Perhaps it's the fact that they can't all unify to decide what the best outcome is if he was to go. They haven't seemingly been much of a push to have a no-confidence motion, so it seems like the opposition are also happy for the moment to sort of put pressure on Ishiba, but not oust him with a no-confidence motion. And so all of this just adds further importance to the July elections, the upper house elections that are coming up. And so, there's really going to be all eyes on them and to see the outcome. And, there's a high probability that it's going to be poor for the LDP, given what happened in 2024. And also, just because Ishiba's stayed on and he's proved to be stable, that doesn't mean that he's necessarily any more popular. And this gift scandal appears to have had an effect on his favourability in the opinion polls. And so that, added on to the past struggles of the LDP, could mean that they could have quite a difficult July election. It'll be interesting to see what happens after that. Now, speaking about these July elections, I'd like to talk about a news story that's come out relating to sort of insider baseball and, brokering within Japanese politics. And that's that there's a potential, really for the LDP, deadly alliance, a really dangerous alliance emerging between two of the opposition parties, which could be quite the threat to the LDP and their position going forward. At the very least, it looks quite alarming for them for the July elections. Now, one of the main advantages, one of the things that's kept them in government time after time, and one of the things that's also been a bit of a solace for the LDP in recent years as they've been going through this sort of difficult period following the recent scandals they've endured, is the fact that their opposition is so divided. Like, for example, who is the clear replacement who would come into government to replace the LDP if they were to lose an election? Now, it's very likely that, knowing Japanese politics and the way things often work out and looking at past history, that it's going to be a coalition of two, if not more, parties that would replace the LDP. That's how things have worked in the past on the few occasions where they've lost government. That's often been what's happened. But which two parties? I mean, for example, is the primary opposition to the LDP CDP, the second most seats? They could, tangibly say, we're the clear replacement. Or is it Ishin, or is it the DPFP? They had a very favourable result, increased their seats by a lot. They're sort of rising in the polls and seen as being this new emerging party, centrist party. Perhaps they could target themselves as the alternative to the LDP. But what's really could be dangerous for the LDP is that two of these opposition parties are now joining up and are sort of presenting a united threat to the LDP in the July elections, at least. What's happening is that Ishin and CDP, two of the biggest opposition parties presenting unified candidates in the upper house election in 3 districts. That's Shiga, Nara and Wakayama. They're going to effectively pool their resources to see who's going to be the best candidate in those districts to sort of really take a challenge to the LDP in that area. The way I believe this will work is that they will go district by district and look at who the potential candidates would have been, and sort of the weaker one, the one least likely to win, will be the one to sort of give way, and a sort of electoral pact to have the most outcome of success, to avoid drawing away votes from each other, having a disunited opposition to the LDP, and maximise the threat of either of those parties winning in an area where there's a unified candidate. And as I say, that really presents a threat to the LDP that what would in the past have been a fractured opposition is going to be united against them. Added that to the fact that this recent difficulty for Ishiba in the polls, that really does look quite dangerous for them, in at least in those districts. Now, we've seen things like this play out in the past. In the UK, for example, tactical voting is very common, where there's all these sort of apps now and websites where you can look at where you live and say, oh, which party do I not want to win? And I'll look at who's the best opposition party, the most likely to win against them, and so I'll vote for that party rather than one I necessarily want. Whereas in this case, rather than sort of trusting the voters to do that, rather than trusting Japanese voters to tactically vote, instead they're having this more formal pact where the party that's effectively going to be a spoiler and is the least likely to win is going to drop out and make way for the party that's most likely to win and beat the LDP in that instance. We've seen this many times throughout politics. For example, in the UK, we've had the Liberal-Labour pact historically was very significant. But, you can think of many examples of parties sort of agreeing either formally like this to sort of stand down and just have one unified candidate, or to sort of, tactfully. What you often see is a party will not vigorously campaign in one area. They might on paper put out a candidate, but they're not really trying that hard because they'd really rather focus their resources elsewhere, or sort of tacitly they're sort of happy enough for the opposition, for someone else to win. But in this instance, it seems like they're formalising things. And what I think is quite interesting about this is, does this suggest a longer-term possible cooperation between Ishin and CDP going forward? That would be very interesting. I mean, it would be, if they were to coordinate this on a wider scale, to have this in the next sort of general election in the lower house, that could be equally very, very threatening for the LDP and would really harm their chances of, as they have now, albeit as a minority government, getting back in. That could seriously harm their electoral prospects. And there's even been murmurings of, could these two work together in the longer term? And perhaps you could be looking at the next government here. So yeah, all very interesting. So it'll be fascinating to see if they expand this beyond these 3 districts, what the vote looks like in July here, and if this friendly cooperation of working towards their common interest, if that lasts and if that could be broadened out. I think that's very threatening for the LDP, and we'll have to see, if this alliance lasts and what happens from there. Now, we've spoken about this sort of burgeoning emerging alliance, but there's also been murmurings I've read online of a potential fractured alliance, and that's the alliance between the LDP and their minor coalition partner, Komeito. Now, you could perhaps see this coming, that perhaps relations could be under threat if this alliance isn't actively maintained. For example, Komeito in the 2024 election, they suffered quite badly. They lost seats, and they had the indignity of the leader of their party being unseated, losing his contest, and so being seatless and having to step down as the leader of Komeito. And that was largely, you could say, at least partly due to the fact that the LDP, after the slush fund and the Unification Church scandal was being seen as less popular, the government was less popular, because Komeito was in government with the LDP. That sort of rubbed off on them and perhaps hurt them in the 2024 election. Now, they're still in government with the LDP, albeit as a minority government, but there's sort of the memory of that harming them in the past. That's potentially could be something that Komeito could look at and be unhappy at and say, oh, well, this has already hurt us before. Are we doing the best thing in our interests here by remaining with the LDP? I'm not necessarily saying they're questioning that openly, at least, but it's something you could imagine they might think about. And also, historically, you've seen that very, very often, to use the UK example, the Liberal Democrats, when they went into a coalition with the Conservatives, it's often what happens in these coalition agreements is that the smaller party, it's harder to be seen as the voice of government. Often when things go well, the major coalition partner takes the credit, and when things go badly, it's the coalition partner, the minority one, that gets hurt as well. The Liberal Democrats in the UK were very badly hurt by being the minority partner of the Conservatives, whereas the Conservatives did reasonably well out of it. And perhaps you could see the same thing happening here. Maybe as a minority party, Komeito don't get the credit for successes, but they get blame shared for the losses, and they're seen as from their voter base as perhaps not doing what they want by being in coalition with the LDP. And also you could see now that as a result of the LDP not being the majority government, they're a minority government, they now have to reach out to other parties, for example Ishin and DPP, for their support if they want to get legislation through. And this means that they're not as reliant on Komeito. Komeito, perhaps, to put it harshly, are less important to the maintaining of the government because they need other parties as well. So it's not just Komeito that they rely on. And so perhaps, as you hear more and more in the press about the concessions that are being given to other parties like Ishin, maybe Komeito see themselves as being taken for granted, or they might see themselves as less important. They now see themselves as having to share credit for getting legislation through with other parties rather than having the sole credit, and perhaps their status is diminished by not being the sole. Although they're not in a formal coalition agreement, the LDP, with these other parties, they are reaching out to them and offering them concessions. And so in that sense, maybe Komeito might think, perhaps, we should be getting more concessions, rather than it being handed out to other parties. You could see that some members might well be thinking that. Purely speculation on my part. The reason I mention this is that I've read reports recently that apparently there's some anxiety from within the party about their status within the coalition and about the best interest, and perhaps they're sort of looking back to how things were in the past, and perhaps they thought in the past, this sort of agreement with the LDP worked a bit better, but perhaps in the wake of now, it seems like there's a bit more anxiety coming from Komeito about the state of their cooperation with the LDP. That's all I've read, simply that there's anxiety and from within the party and sort of questions. Speculation on my part, but perhaps it's due to, as I say, the 2024 election loss and this status they have now where they're not the sole party that the LDP has to rely on. It could maybe make them think about that a little bit more. Now, the LDP has actually had some good news this week. It must be quite nice for Ishiba. Although Ishiba has had to make concessions, he has managed to get his budget passed, which must be quite a relief. He's had to do a fair bit of politicking. He's had to work with the DPP. He's had to work with Ishin to get it through. He's had to make concessions, which is something that's perhaps hurt the sort of standing of Ishiba, his reputation. The fact that he's had the general public see him making these concessions has perhaps maybe hurt him a little bit. But in the end, he has managed to get it through. Now, he got this budget through by making concessions to Ishin in terms of expanding free high school education, and the DPP in terms of raising the tax threshold. So it perhaps hurts the LDP's standing to be seen as not being able to pass legislation on their own, and also having to make these concessions in order to get other parties to cooperate them and to go along. But nonetheless, you have to say it's a success. At least he's managed to get the budget passed. He's managed to get legislation through, which is good for him. It means the wheels of government can keep turning. And as I say, with Ishiba staying in his job, not standing down after the GIS scandal, it adds to sort of that element of stability. I mean, at the very least, you could say things would be much worse for him if he was suddenly unable to pass a budget. That would be disastrous, really, for the stability of his government. And that's the last thing he wants ahead of these July elections. So that you can say that, after politicking and, ongoing discussions, he at least has got the budget through, can be seen as a good thing. However, there is a further negative story for Ishiba, which is this latest emergence of talk about auto tariffs coming from President Trump and the USA, which has very bad potential consequences, to say the very least, for Ishiba. Now, Ishiba has been pushing for exceptions to this, and he's even suggested that he might go for another visit. He at least hasn't ruled out that he might go for another visit and sit-down talks with Trump. But surely this has to be, just so gutting and disappointing for Ishiba. He only just very recently sat down with Trump, and those talks were seen to go fairly well. They were, after some tension about, would Trump have a meeting? How well does Trump see Ishiba? Would they get on? They at least got the big PR moment of sitting down, shaking hands. It seemed to go fairly well. Ishiba agreed a couple of deals with Trump, and it looked like relations would maybe look to be going in a positive direction with Trump and the USA, and despite all the fears before that meeting. And that was, seen as a bit of a, one of the successes that Ishiba's had, getting that meeting with Trump, getting a sit down and it going fairly positively. But that seems to have been completely wiped out by these, to some extent at least, by these auto tariff talks and these threat of tariffs. You sort of hoped that having a positive meeting with Trump would have nipped all this in the bud, but no, it's emerged once again. And there's talks of yet another visit. It sort of undermines the positivity of the first one, to say the least. Now, the Japanese economy is very much export reliant. They have a strong car business, to say the least. With a lot of exports going to the USA, that's very good for their economy. And there's been talk of a 25% tariffs on cars, which would be, terrible for the economy. And just the absolute last thing Ishiba wants, last thing he could use for the economy right now. And it undermines all these positive things he had going, not just the Trump meeting, but it undermines the positivity of his budget. Because although they did come out as concessions, they were these sort of things that happened in terms of giving, more free high school education, and that's seen as, good for Japanese families, and raising the tax threshold, which is seen as, good for working people in Japan. And perhaps those are seen as things that Ishin and the DPP will take credit for rather than the LDP. At least it's a positive coming out of his budget, even if they are concessions that he was sort of, his arm was twisted a little bit to make to get his budget through. But if suddenly there's this hit to the economy from auto tariffs, all that positivity and the idea that Ishiba's doing positive things, through his budget for families and for working people, that takes a major hit, and the perception that the economy is getting better and that Ishiba's offering assurances and help, that goes away if suddenly that a 25% tariff hits Japanese cars. It would be very bad for their economy, and even the threat of it, is going to have negative consequences, and the uncertainty of it hanging out in the air. Now, there has been talk, as I say, of Ishiba going out there, and he's hoping that he can get an exception to this. So, this isn't the final story, and it could just be, Trump throwing this out there, hoping he'll get more concessions, and he'll get something out of Ishiba, or just to put a bit of pressure on. It might not be that Trump actually intends this, but the threat is quite serious. What could Ishiba's potential response to this be, apart from obviously going out for a visit? Well, there's been talk that he could have measures such as supporting the economy, so effectively providing support and funding for car companies that are threatened, perhaps through either sort of a stopgap, when there's uncertainty, when these tariffs happen for the first time, or perhaps longer term, I don't know. But that's been floated out there. There might be some sort of funding support from the Japanese government. But obviously, to say the very least, that's far from an ideal solution, and certainly not in the long term. But that has been floated out there as well. But yeah, that sort of rounds up the Japanese political news. As I say, Ishiba's still in the job, and he's had some good news this his budget passing, but also a fair bit of bad news in this alliance emerging, and perhaps murmurings of uncertainty from Komeito, and then these auto tariffs. And so we'll just have to see how he navigates all these issues and what else pops up in the coming weeks and months as we head to that very important July election. But that really rounds out the show from there, guys. And thank you so much for listening. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Whittaker. Sayonara, goodbye.